Hey, I'm Dean and this is Legacy Voyage. In Season 1, I'm documenting my journey to earning my first 100K net worth as a full-time college student. Join me as I share some of the lessons I learned along the way.
One thing I'm kind of known for in my family is being a bad driver. And it's not necessarily like a bad thing, but I've kind of lived up to it or fed into that type of idea or identity. Because truth be told, I don't like driving. And this past weekend was a great example. So basically, I went to Cali this past weekend and I get in super late. I think it was like at 11 p.m. And so back here in Chicago, it's like 1, almost 2. So I'm landing and I'm super tired. I'm like, okay, I just want to go home. So my uncle picks me up, we head home, and of course, I knock out immediately. But the next morning, my auntie came in. So she just flew in from the airport, and she's trying to find rides. She's like, who can pick me up from the airport? Now, honestly, while this all is going on, I have no idea because I was knocked out. But the one who answers her call, or the one who goes out to get her, pick her up, is my brother. Because a little backstory on this, growing up, especially in high school, I never drove. Like, I literally didn't even get my license till like a year ago, which was when I was 19. I'm 19, but I got my license at 19. So throughout all of high school, I didn't have my license because I kept depending on my brother, who was like, he was the one who was known to be the driver. He's the driver of the family. So whenever anyone needs a ride, whenever anyone needs someone to drive them somewhere, he's the one that they go to. And for me, I kind of see it as like a beneficial thing. Everyone can see me as a bad driver. That's whatever. But as long as I don't have to drive and I can get out of it, I'm fine with that. I'm cool with that. And this past weekend, that was a great example of it because I think they came in at like 6 in the morning or 8 in the morning or whatever. And my brother was the one to pick them up, who drove like an hour to LAX, the LA airport, and drove an hour back to where we were staying. And get this, he slept after me. So he might have even been more tired than I was. But because he had that identity of being known as the good driver and I was known as like the bad driver or the one who doesn't drive, then he was the one who kind of took up that responsibility. And there are a couple other things in my life that this kind of applied to as well. One of them being dishes. Dishes is actually a great example because growing up, I almost never did dishes. The reason was I was more like the trash guy, so my chore was always taking out the trash. But whenever it came time for someone to do the dishes, I would always back out and I'd tell my mom, oh, I don't know how to do the dishes. Or there were times where I would go and I would do the dishes, but I would do it bad. And so my mom would be like, okay, no, he's not good at doing the dishes. So you do the dishes, someone else, to one of my siblings. And they would have to do it instead of me because I was bad at doing the dishes. And I didn't realize there was like a term or word for this. When I was listening to a podcast talking about empathy and how sometimes if we're too empathetic, it could be a bad thing. And the example that was brought up in the podcast that really made me take a step back and I'm like, okay, maybe I got to switch up a couple things. But it's when you have a mother who's super empathetic toward their son and their son uses it as an advantage or as a weapon to get what they want. Like, for example, if the son doesn't want to cook or doesn't want to clean anything, doesn't want to do laundry or any of those things, then the mom, feeling super empathetic for the son, will do everything for them and not really giving the son a chance to be independent. And so he pretends like he's bad at all these things. Like how I was pretending to be bad at driving or bad at doing the dishes as a way to get out of responsibility. And the term for that is weaponized incompetence, where I'm pretending like I'm incompetent in something and using that as a weapon to get out of responsibility. The caveat I will say is that I probably am like low key a bad driver. I wouldn't say bad driver, but my quote unquote bad driving is not on purpose. Like I remember this one time where I was driving with the whole fam and we got people in the back of the trunk and I'm over here trying to figure out the Google Maps and took a whole bunch of wrong turns, making the whole trip like 10 minutes longer than it needed to be. But that's the story, kind of combining this idea of like weaponizing competence with driving and how I finally realized that being a bad driver in this sense, like having weaponizing competence is probably an unhealthy thing to do. Now, moving on to the next section is an update on my weekly intention. So last week, I set the intention to stay on top of tracking my food using Macro Factor, and straight up, I just didn't do that. I mean, I think I was stuck with it for like a day, maybe 2 days. But after that, I just didn't keep track of anything anymore. And the reason I will say, or at least part of the reason that fed into why I didn't track my food has probably something to do with that trip going down to Cali this past weekend. Because that took a lot out of me and it made me had a huge realization. But I'll talk more about that when I'm onto the L's of the week section. But onto the philosophizing section where I go over some random ideas and thoughts that come into my head. The first one I already mentioned, weaponizing competence. The second one will come up again in L's of the week, but it's this idea of doing X for the sake of doing X. Now you can insert whatever you want, like traveling for the sake of traveling, or continuing for the sake of continuing, or eating for the sake of eating. But this is something I thought about because not only was I traveling, but also you got like the binge eating aspect. But I was catching up with a guy. He was one of my bosses from a past internship. I'm pretty sure I brought him up before on this podcast, but we were just catching up, checking in, seeing how things are going. And he gave me a huge update. Basically, he's ending his search fund, or at least very likely going to end his search fund because his parents decided to move back to the States. Because I think currently they live in India, but now they're moving back to the States in Boston, where his sister lives, and his other sister is about to graduate school and she might move to Boston. And so he's like, there's no better opportunity to move with my family. And he said something in that conversation that has really stuck with me. First of all, I think it's really cool and it shows his priorities of where he's at for him to stop his search and move for his family. And I think that's really, really cool. The second thing is that in the conversation, he said, there's really no point of continuing the search simply for the sake of continuing. So that was part of the reason why he wanted to stop doing the search and move on to something new, which in this case happened to be. But like I mentioned, I think this doesn't have to only apply to this idea of continuing for the sake of continuing. I think it also applies to like eating or traveling or really anything else. But it's super powerful when there's truly a reason or a purpose behind doing something. For example, rather than eating for the sake of eating and chewing and putting food in your mouth or in my mouth, because this is like a personal thing, it's probably better to view it more as eating for the sake of hitting my protein goals, or eating for the sake of taste, or eating for the sake of social reasons, like being around people. Like all of those reasons seem to be better than merely eating for the sake of eating. One thing I was thinking about this week. Another thing is I'm being reminded of all these lessons of how my life was when I was a student athlete. And I played football in high school. I mean, technically, I still am a student athlete, just not as much anymore, I guess, would be the best description. Because I probably wouldn't consider myself a student athlete. But in high school, I definitely was. And the reason I'm thinking about this is because there's a friend of mine who's just got into high school now, and he's beginning to see the student athlete life. And it's reminded me of my journey and some of the lessons that I learned in being a student athlete. One of those lessons is this idea of self-worth. Because in high school, most people will probably know this, but making it to varsity is like a pretty big deal. If you're a freshman or a sophomore and you make it to varsity, then it's like, okay, that person's super, super good. And so as a student athlete, that's how I kind of measured self-worth. It's like, okay, I'm good or I'm valuable if I can become a varsity athlete. And when I was a sophomore, the reason this hit harder even more is because my cousin made it onto varsity, who was also a sophomore, and I didn't. And so for me as that kid, I was super, super sad about that. Like, I actually took it to heart. And this kind of gets into the second lesson that helped me a bunch is being a student athlete. It taught me what it means to put in the work and to be hungry. Because that same summer when my cousin made varsity and I didn't, I would literally go to JV practices. And then after those practices, I would go to varsity practices because I was just that hungry. And then I remember sending an email to the head coach being like, hey, I really want to practice with varsity. Would you be okay with that? And so he asked the D-line coach, because I was a D-lineman at the time. He was like, are you okay with that? And that D-lineman coach, he was like, if he's hungry, then let him eat. That's something else. Like, it really taught me how to put in the work because my schedule was like insane, especially trying to balance seminary with all that stuff. Like, I definitely put in the work being in high school. But the third lesson is that in some ways, I think being an athlete, being a student athlete and playing sports, in some ways prepared me for the world better than school did. Because here's how school was for me growing up. You go to elementary school and the entire time you're there, all they're saying is they're preparing you for middle school. And then you finally graduate elementary school and then you go to middle school. And then the entire time you're over there, all you hear is, oh, we're preparing you for high school. And then you finally get to high school and they're like, okay, we're preparing you to be good college students. And then you finally get to college, where I'm at right now. And out here, all they're really doing is preparing you to graduate with a degree. Beyond that, I mean, it's not much. But that really made me realize that the only thing that truly prepares you for the real world is actually going into the real world and getting that experience and going into the trenches. Because you don't get that same type of experience when you're sitting in a classroom taking a test. You just don't. But something else I was thinking about is how most things in life are simple, but very, very difficult. Like I was reading a post and it said, oh, getting rich is easy. All you have to do is make money and then keep the money you make. And it's like, well, duh, everyone knows that. But actually putting that into action is way, way hard. Same thing for losing weight. All you have to do is burn more calories than you eat. Very, very simple. But actually putting that into action, pretty difficult. And the reason it's difficult, I think, is because you have to start dealing with all these human emotions, like what it means to be a human, which I think is probably where things start getting a little tougher. Now, another thing I've been thinking about is this idea of a Rocky cutscene. Alex Hormozy brings this up a bunch too, but he all the time talks about his Rocky cutscene where he was in the trenches and there were literally times where he had to sleep on the floor of his gym for like a whole month and barely got like 3-4 hours of sleep because there were people who were partying every single night and you couldn't get any sleep. Now, I was reminded of this idea again because this past week, doing the jumpstart at the garage, they bring in all these guest speakers of big time people working on startups, all these founders, and they tell their stories. So for example, one of them was the founder of Bondside, which is like a financing thing for brick and mortar businesses. And she was telling her story, how she graduated from college, then went into Bain, and then from there went to be a co-founder at one business, and then spun off to do something else. Or there was another story I heard literally just today, this morning, where he graduated, went to McKinsey, found a couple dudes who were bouncing ideas off of each other, and then decided to go off and become founders. So they went and built this food and beverage company called Crafty. But as they're telling their stories, like all the pivots they went through, all the failures, they usually caveat it with they're telling the story super smoothly. In the moment, it is way tougher. A better example might be something like this. The Rocky cutscene only lasts 5 seconds in the movie, but it lasts 5 years in real life. I think that's a better way to put it, because these people, they tell their stories and it seems to flow together and it seems so easy and fast. And for us, the people who are listening to the stories, like, oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, you made those pivots, you went through those struggles. Yeah, it's whatever. But when you're actually in the moment and going through the work and in the trenches, it feels way longer than the 5-minute story or 5-second story that they tell. It's one of the reasons I'm super excited about this podcast is because whenever I go out there in the future and I'm telling the story and I'm like, oh yeah, there was this one time I was in college and really went through a hard time with binge eating or did a couple pivots with We Are Nesian. And in the future, I'll be telling that story and it'll seem like things are so easy. Everything just flows together and comes together so smoothly. But right now, because I am literally living through it, it is way harder than how it'll seem in the future. Because one of my big hopes is that with this, I'll be able to go into the future and tell my stories, but then have something to look back on and be like, and if you want to hear about how this journey was, take a look at this episode. Or literally be like, I recorded my entire journey up to here since I was 18. You can go back, listen to the podcast, and listen through the decisions I was thinking about and things that were on my mind and problems that I was going through and how I overcame them. That's literally what this podcast is. So that gets me super excited about, making these things, because I put a ton of effort into recording these. Not really that much effort, but I put the effort into it because of that vision of what it'll become in the future. And that just gets me super, super excited. But the final thing for this section, the philosophizing section, is something I've been reading about. So the book I'm reading, and I'll bring this up in the weekly roundup as well, but I've been reading an epistemology book, which is like basically just the study of knowledge. And it brings up this problem that I think is pretty fundamental to a lot of things I've been thinking through, especially when it comes to religion. But it's called the problem of Criterion. And the easiest way I can think of explaining it is it's kind of like the chicken and the egg problem. Like, which one comes first? Because in this problem of Criterion, it poses 2 questions, one after the other. And the reason it seems like a paradox or like it can't be solved is because to answer the first question, it seems like you have to answer the second question. But to answer the second question, it seems like you have to answer the first question. And so you really don't know which question to answer first. But the problem of Criterion is like this. It asks, which beliefs are true? That's the first question. And the second one is, what is the criterion for true? Here's an analogy that might be helpful and might make things more confusing, but I'll say it anyways. In Christianity, there's this thing called canon. And all canon is like which books of scripture actually belong in the Bible. Or a better description might be which books of scripture or which books are God's word. And then depending on who you ask, the Protestant will probably say something like the Bible. The Mormon might say, oh, we have the Bible and the Book of Mormon and all the other scriptures. The Muslim might say we got the Quran. So that's how they might answer the first question. But then you get to the second question. It's how do you know which books are truly inspired by God? And that's where this starts to get difficult, because it seems like in order for you to know which books are inspired by God, you have to list a certain set of criterion. Like, here's how we know a book is inspired by God. It has these things. 1, 2, 3, and 4. But then in order to know those things, you'd first have to identify a book that truly is the inspired word of God. And then from that, you can work off, okay, that thing has these set of criterion. Now we can go out and apply it to the other books and see which ones truly are the inspired word of God. And so I'm not sure if that analogy made sense. Because low-key, it didn't make sense while I'm telling you right now, but you can probably tell I don't really fully understand this whole problem, which is the reason why I'm reading books on this stuff, because I find it fascinating. Anyways, maybe tomorrow I'll recap or come back to this idea to keep reading it. But moving on to the L of the week, and this is something that I'm really excited to talk about because it was personally a huge epiphany for me. So this past weekend, like I mentioned at the start of this episode, I went to Cali over the weekend. So I'm in Chicago right now. So I went to Cali for literally less than 48 hours, I want to say. I landed probably around 10, 11 Friday night, and then flew out morning. So literally less than 48 hours, which to be honest, isn't abnormal for my family. Because we have flying benefits, it isn't completely out of the ordinary to fly places for a couple days over the weekend. But this specific weekend came over, and like I mentioned in the last podcast episode, it was kind of like a way to gauge where I'm at, how well I can control myself, and really see where I'm at in this whole process. Well, I did that, and I realized something that I'm going to take with me moving forward whenever I'm considering traveling. But from now on, I don't want to travel simply for the sake of traveling. Because in this example, technically I did travel for family. I traveled because one of my little nieces had her birthday and she was getting baptized into the church. And so it's sort of like a big deal in the religion and in the culture. So people pulled up for it. But when I went there, I literally didn't get to spend like any quality family time at all because I was usually just dead tired. And so as soon as I landed, I was immediately tired. So I wasn't able to hang out with the fam, with my cousins. I went straight home, went to bed. Next morning, woke up, went through the eating, but realistically didn't have any quality time with the fam. And so I came back super tired. I wouldn't say I was binge eating then, but I was definitely overeating. And overall, it was just very unhealthy for my own personal physical health. And so from now on, I don't want to travel simply for the sake of traveling. I want to travel for a higher purpose or a better purpose than mere travel. Like traveling for quality time with the family. And I think next week or the week after, the plan is to go on a cruise with the fam. I think we're headed from Florida to the Bahamas or something. But that, in my eyes, is this amazing way for me to spend quality time with my family instead of like a quick, less than 48-hour trip where I'm dead tired the whole time and barely even spend time with my family, like the whole reason that I want to be traveling in the first place. So that was an L in the sense that I was traveling for the sake of traveling, but now after learning that lesson, it's a huge dub because now I'm definitely going to be applying that for myself into the future. Coolio. Now moving on to the weekly roundup where I go over some random things I found over the week. Quotes, articles, books, podcasts, whatever. The first thing I found was this quote by Warren Buffett. And it's something that I've kind of been thinking about, but I think he has a little more authority, you might say. So because he says it, people are probably more willing to listen, me included. But the quote is this: the big question about how people behave is whether they've got an inner scorecard or an outer scorecard. It helps if you can be satisfied with an inner scorecard. And so just like I was talking about with the whole self-worth thing as being a student athlete, like instead of having an outer scorecard being, oh, I made varsity, or oh, my grades are good, and that determines my value, having an inner scorecard like Warren Buffett says here, being like, okay, I can look within myself to find my value. And in some cases, I mean, straight up, it might be a bad scorecard, a bad inner scorecard. And that's because the outer self and the inner self are misaligned. Or more accurately, it would be because the inner self is misaligned with the dream identity. Or at least that's what I'm thinking through in my head with this whole dream identity framework. The question I've been kind of pondering about this week is, how do you become worthy? And ways to think about this question is like, for leaders, how do you become worthy of leading, let's say, $1 million company? Or how do you become worthy of attracting the type of person you want to marry? Or more recently, I was rewatching that Egypt movie. What was it called? It's like King of Egypt. It was the Moses movie. And in that movie, and in the story of Moses, there's this point where he goes to the burning bush and God calls him and says, go and lead your people out of Egypt. And that in my head is like literally the perfect example of a leader who is being called to do something. But in that moment, Moses was like, man, I don't feel worthy of leading those people. By all means, like I would definitely feel the same way. Man's just a random dude He literally killed a guy. And now here he is being called to go and rescue his people and lead them out of Egypt. In the moment, he was like, bro, there's no way. I don't feel worthy of this. And so that has kind of been stuck with me all day. As I was talking with some LDS missionaries too, I was like thinking about this idea, because something I've noticed, especially within this LDS church, is that a lot of these missionaries, straight out of high school, literally fresh, just turned 18, 19, whatever, and they don't really know basically anything, like just straight up, especially when it comes to a religion or the church or anything like that. And so in my head, when I'm kind of thinking through it, they ask me this question like, well, why didn't you serve? Well, the answer I would have is that I don't feel worthy. The same way Moses kind of did, where I don't feel like my testimony of this church or my faith in Joseph Smith or whatever, I don't feel like it is at a high enough level where I can start going out and preaching it. And I'm trying to think through parallels of how that can be applied to like becoming a leader, basically. Where in some ways, like feeling unworthy to lead a 10-person team or feeling unworthy to build a $1 million company. And so I guess I've been kind of thinking about that question of how do I become worthy? And maybe at the end of the day, the answer is just like taking those small steps forward toward the person we want to become, toward that dream identity. Maybe that's how you just become worthy. Or there's this other quote that has really stuck with me. It goes something like, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And so Moses was a perfect example of that. He qualified Moses. Now for the podcast that I found, it was on modern wisdom with one of the mental health guys that I like following. His name is Healthy Gamer GG, something like that, but Dr. K is his name. And I don't know, I really like some of the stuff he has to say about mental health and emotions and all that stuff. But on this podcast, there were a couple key takeaways that I had with me. One thing he mentioned, and I always bring this up, is that they were talking about social media and why it seems so addicting. And it's like, is it just because of the dopamine? And he brought up this story or this analogy where if a girl who just got dumped is scrolling through social media with their ex or with a new girlfriend, is it because of the huge burst of dopamine they get? It's like, no. The reason they do that is to run away from their emotions. And I identify with that like super well. This idea of running away from emotions by turning to some type of addiction. But in this case, it would be food. Like running away from my emotions to go eat, simply for the sake of eating. So he brought up that idea in the podcast. And he also said something that I keep bringing up too, is this idea of a purpose being super, super powerful. And so he's worked with a whole bunch of people who had different types of addiction. And what he's found or what he's seen work is when they find some type of higher purpose. And that could be a religion or that could be whatever you want it to be. But having that sense of higher purpose allows you to do hard things. Like an example would be someone like Elon Musk. With all of his businesses, he turns it into these species-saving, world-saving businesses. It's like, this business is going to save the world. For example, SpaceX. It's like, we're going to make it a multi-planetary species. Or Tesla, we're going to make renewable energy available everywhere. And so the reason those hard things become easy is because everyone is working for this higher purpose, this bigger mission that's outside of themselves. And that's what Dr. K has found is super helpful when trying to overcome these addictions or when trying to process emotions and everything. But another thing that really helps with processing emotions that he suggested is to embrace boredom. So that when you're bored, being able to sit with yourself and sit with your thoughts, that's something that's super, super powerful. So something he suggested for a lot of his patients is for them to go to the bathroom without their phones. And a lot of the times when he suggests this thing, a lot of people will be like, what? That's impossible. What else am I going to do while I'm pooping? And then Chris Williams said, he's like, just be one with the poop. Be with the... And I just thought that was so funny and so true too. Truly trying to take time for yourself and be with your thoughts is like this really, really powerful thing. Because my entire life growing up, people are always like, oh, those shower thoughts are like nothing else. But realistically, the only reason we have those shower thoughts, like there's nothing super magical about the shower. It's just that we haven't made waterproof phones yet. So as soon as you make those waterproof phones, like, or even now when they start bringing in speakers and people use that instead of showering in silence, it's like this way of not being with themselves. So they really can't be bored. And I think that's one of the reasons why I really, really enjoy walking, taking out the earphones and just being with myself. It allows me to think. And that's just something that I really enjoy doing. On to the book that I was talking about. It's called Epistemology, 50 Puzzles, Paradoxes, and Thought Experiments. But it walks through a whole bunch of, like it says, thought experiments, puzzles, relating to epistemology, because that's really my big interest in this whole philosophy thing. And that's where I found the problem of Criterion. But the book has honestly been really, really enjoyable. Like it gets me to question a whole bunch of different things. And now I'm trying to dive into some of the problems it brings up in the book. But to round out the weekly roundup for this week, there's an article called What Do You Want to Want? And this was brought up in the podcast that I recommended earlier, but this article I found was pretty fascinating. And here's a quote from it. It says, "If we don't pause and ask ourselves what we want to want, we spend our lives focused on unhealthy aims defined for us by others." And so instead of asking yourself, what do you want? Because usually that's defined by others like money, fame, power, glory, all those things. Instead, asking yourself, what do you want to want? Or asking myself, what do I want to want? And a lot of that would be pretty in line with my dream identity. What I want to want is what my dream identity wants. And when I place Jesus Christ as that dream identity, it really gives me a lot of direction on where I want to go. Because all I want is what Jesus Christ wants. And all he wanted was peace and love and all those things that he talks about in the Bible. But there's another quote that I really like that says, "Because our imagination is so great at so many things, we rely on it even in situations where it's useless. The best trick I found to counter this is to develop a bias toward action." And I thought this was super, super applicable to me because, I mean, I've been going on and on about being, I guess that's what it means to be a philosopher, to be a consultant, is like all this thinking. And when you start thinking like 20 moves ahead, like in chess, it gets to the point where you haven't even taken the first step forward. And so it made me think of like consultants and typical philosophers, they'll more so have a bias toward thinking and making PowerPoints and like theory and stuff. Whereas entrepreneurs and pragmatists, people who actually want to get things done, they'll have more of a bias toward action. But that's all for that section. And finally wrapping up the podcast, moving on to the life update. Let me see. First, we got update on my God. I think it's very, very interesting. Like I mentioned, this past Sunday, I started taking this LDS Temple class prep thing. And so in the class, we talk about the LDS Temple. And sitting in that class, the question that came into my mind is whether I should even be there in the first place. Because just like Moses, I really did feel unworthy in some way. Because I'm still wrestling with the more fundamental question, like whether or not the LDS Church truly is the Church of Jesus Christ. And because I'm wrestling with that more fundamental question, it didn't seem like I was worthy enough to be in that class where we're talking about these things that are probably, or actually definitely more further down the line, I feel. So I was debating, I was like, is it one of those like line upon line, precept upon precept things where I don't start diving into things that are way beyond where I'm at right now? Or is it one of those things where learning about the temple more and more will actually help me come to a better understanding of Jesus Christ or his church? Honestly, still trying to think through that. If nothing else, I enjoy conversations about religion. And so that class definitely got me thinking. And as you know, your boy loves to think. Maybe that's might be like my biggest, what's it called? Weakness, disadvantage, con as an entrepreneur, is that I like to think. So who knows? Maybe I'll be a great consultant, but that's for my future self to figure out. Anyways, up onto the update on myself. Like I mentioned this past weekend, like no cap was kind of rough. Didn't really track my food, super tired for most of it. So physical health definitely wasn't the greatest. Mental health, again, wasn't the greatest. But I really do think that epiphany around traveling will help me a ton moving forward. Because now that I have that as like a framework to kind of think through, then it'll help me make decisions better on whether to go to a family function or not, or go for a quick trip or not. That'll really help a ton. For the update on my people, it's been, again, pretty good. Like this past week, been playing like pickleball and salsa classes and whatever, but meeting some good people, chilling with more people, part of the garage, the same fools going through Jumpstart. But yeah, I guess the other thing is from last weekend, I didn't really get to spend much quality time with the fam. And really when I keep saying that, it's more like I didn't have many quality conversations with the fam. Because I think that's my love language, is quality conversations. And so not being able to talk with them, I guess that was kind of like something that didn't really go well with my people. But like I keep mentioning, it's an L and a failure, but also a huge lesson, and just gonna fail forward with that one. And finally, update on my work. I think this one is really interesting. So this past Monday, like I mentioned, I think in the last episode, we're preparing for this pitch deck. And so on Monday, everyone was giving their pitch, talking about what they're doing and everything. And so everyone gave their pitch. And everyone was giving it. I was like, nothing is like super good. And even on mine, I was like, it's just whatever, something I was practicing. And it was kind of funny because on the moments leading up to when I was going to give my pitch, I was like breathing heavy and my hands are sweaty and everything. But there was something that I keep bringing up, or at least I brought it up in past episodes, but it's re-identifying these emotions. And so instead of telling myself I'm scared or I'm nervous or I'm fearful of going up to speak, I kept telling myself, like, I'm excited to go and speak. I can't wait. And so after I gave the whole pitch, didn't really think much of it. But after the pitch, people kept coming up to me. They're like, oh man, you killed it. You did the best. You're like, you were definitely the most confident up there. There are a couple thoughts I had around this. The first one is that it feels unreal, like kind of like imposter syndrome, because in a lot of ways, realistically, I shouldn't be at Jumpstart. Like I remember Brylan gave me that $1,000 challenge, and with that challenge, realistically, I shouldn't even be at Jumpstart because they were probably gonna say no to me of getting in. That's the first thing. And when people kept coming up to me, they're like asking me for advice about the pitch and telling me mines are so good and all that stuff. I was like, hey, it really did feel like imposter syndrome to be the one that everyone was striving to be like, at least in terms of the pitch. So that was one thing that did feel kind of off. The other thing, probably another reason why I fell off, is because in conversations, I like to be the one who's asking the questions and the one who's learning in the conversation rather than the one who's doing most of the teaching, which is kind of weird because in this podcast, it's just me and myself, like kind of just going off the top and sharing everything I learned. But usually in conversations, I try to be the one who's learning. And so when people came up to me, they're like, hey, what do you think we could do to make our pitch better? It's like, I don't know, because I like to be the one learning from other people. So maybe that's another reason why I felt kind of off. But there were positive things I will say around it. There was one thing that really helped with the pitch itself, and public speaking in general. This podcast has helped a ton, like an absolutely insane amount. Because if you go back and listen to the very first podcast on one of these, like, bro, I had the most plain voice, no tone inflection, no nothing. And so it was just the most boring thing in the world. But as I've been doing this and practicing speaking out loud and doing different things with my voice and pausing in certain moments, that really has helped me a ton with doing the pitch. And so there's like a lot of smaller things that I do in the pitch itself where I'm giving it. I'm like, sometimes I go louder, sometimes I go quieter, sometimes I go slower or faster, or make my voice tone go a certain way. But it's all these things that I've learned pretty much just from doing, just from action, which is this podcast. So I guess in some ways I do have a bias toward action. I think outside of that, something I've really been trying to work on this past week, I'm making that my weekly intention. Something I've been trying to work on is being more productive with my time. Because I think, especially lately, I've been getting caught up in these traps doing shallow work. Where I'll literally do, like, I'll be sitting at my computer and clicking buttons and dragging different things for a solid like 4 or 5 hours. But realistically, I only get like minutes worth of deep work done. And this coming week, I really want to focus more on deep work, on really honing in and focusing in on getting as much work done as possible in a short amount of time and not getting distracted. Because I mean, even today, a lot of times I'll get distracted, pull up LinkedIn, pull up my emails, check it, and then that would send me off on a whole side quest, a whole side tangent. And then I'd finish up that, and then I'd get pulled into another thing. And so I wouldn't really be able to work on what I actually wanted to do. So that'll be my weekly intention for this week. It'll be prioritizing deep work. But I think that's all for this episode. I'm looking forward to the next one because I guess in the next episode, I'll give an update on, and I'll probably be heading out to Vegas after. So we'll see. But I guess I'll catch you in the next episode. I record these episodes completely free to share success with everyone. So the only thing I ask is that if you learned anything or found something interesting in this episode, just leave a review and share it with a friend. Only takes 5 seconds and it would mean the world. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next episode. Tatok see you.